Warning: the video you are about to watch may contain language and scenarios of a highly adult nature and is therefore not intended for children under the age of 18. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey, what's up guys? This is Couch Potato Mike back in the book club for part 4 of Gabriel's Inferno by Sylvain Reynard. Before we get into this, I just want to remind you guys that I'm still on the road to 1,000 subs and I've got a bet to win, so please subscribe, hit that like button, hit the bell so you know when these are coming out, and away we go. Remember, comment down below. I read all of your comments. I'm going to start with Chapter 7. Julia parked her bike next to the Clark's large white home and walked to the front porch. She never knocked when she visited them, so she skipped up the stairs and pulled the screen door open. What she found inside shocked her. A glass coffee table in the living room was smashed, blood spattered on the carpet, chairs and cushions were strewn about, and Rachel and Aaron sat huddled together on the sofa in the center of the room. Rachel was sobbing. Julia stood there gaping in horror. What happened? Gabriel, said Aaron. Gabriel, is he hurt? He's fine, Rachel laughed almost hysterically. He's been home less than 24 hours, and he's already gotten into a shoving match with my dad, made my mom cry twice, and sent Scott to the hospital. Aaron continued rubbing his girlfriend's back in order to comfort her, a grim expression on his face. Julia gasped, Why? Who knows? No one ever knows what goes on with him. He got into an argument with Dad. Mom stepped in between them. Gabriel shoved her. Scott said he'd kill him if he ever touched her again. So Gabriel threw a punch and broke his nose. Julia gazed down at the pieces of glass that were now embedded with blood in the carpet. A dozen or so cookies, crumbled now, were scattered in and around the glass, along with the remains of what appeared to be a couple of cups of coffee. And this? She pointed at the macabre mess. Gabriel pushed Scott through the coffee table. Scott and Dad are at the hospital. Mom is locked in a room, and I'm spending the night at Aaron's. Rachel began to drag her boyfriend to the front door. Julia stood frozen. Am I recording? Yes, I am. Julia stood frozen to the spot, unable to move. Maybe I'll try to talk to your mom. I can't stay in this house another minute. My family has just been destroyed. With that, Rachel fled with Aaron. Julia intended to climb the stairs to find Grace, but she heard a noise coming from the direction of the kitchen, so she quietly padded to the back of the house. Through the open back door, she could see someone sitting on the porch, swigging a beer bottle to his lips. A shock of brown hair shone in the fading sunlight. Julia recognized him from Rachel's photographs. Before she had time to think about it, her feet walked out of the back door and she found herself sitting some distance from him on a chaise lounge, her knees drawn up under her chin. She wrapped her arms around her legs and looked over at him. He ignored her. Julia traced his appearance with her eyes, hoping to burn the vision into her memory. He was far better looking in person. She looked at his blue, bloodshot eyes, which were startling under his brown brows. She followed the angle of his high cheekbones, his straight, noble nose, and the squareness of his jaw, noting the 2 or 3 days' growth of beard that shadowed his skin and the kiss of a dimple. Her eyes came to a rest on his full lips, noticing the curve and fullness of the lower one, before she was able to drag her gaze reluctantly to look at his bruises. Gabriel had bruises and blood on his right hand and something purple on his left cheek. Scott's fist had met its mark, but surprisingly, Gabriel was still conscious. You're a bit late for the 6 o'clock show. It ended 30 minutes ago. His voice was gentle and almost as pleasing as his features. Julia thought momentarily about what it would be like to hear that voice pronounce her name. She shivered. There's a blanket right there. He gestured to a large plaid wool blanket that had bunched up near his hip. Without looking at her, he patted it. Julia watched him warily. Satisfied that his anger had cooled, she walked over to him and sat on a nearby stool, still keeping a healthy distance between them. She wondered how fast he could run, and how fast she could run if he was chasing her. He handed her the blanket. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling it around her shoulders. Out of the corner of her eye, she took in his figure and noted how he had folded his considerable height casually into an Adirondack chair. His shoulders appeared broader in the black leather jacket, the planes of his pectorals visible underneath the fabric of his tight black t-shirt. His long legs filled out his black jeans well, and Julia noticed that he seemed taller and heavier than he had looked in his sister's old pictures. She wanted to say something. She wanted to ask why he had gone berserk on the nicest family she'd ever met. But she was too shy and too scared of him to do that. So she asked him if he had a bottle opener instead. He frowned at her before pulling out one from his back pocket and passing it over. She thanked him and continued to sit there quietly. He turned to the half-empty case of beer behind him, chose a bottle, and held it in front of her. "Allow me," he said, seeing her now and smiling. He took the opener back, uncapping her beer with one swift movement and clanking their bottles together. "Cheers." Julia sipped her drink politely, trying not to choke as the strange, yeasty flavor entered her mouth. She hummed unconsciously and waited. "Ever had a beer before?" Gabriel grinned. She shook her head. "Then I'm glad I'm your first." She blushed and hid her face behind her long mahogany hair. "What are you doing here?" He wore a curious expression. Julia paused, wondering how best to put it. "I was invited to dinner. I was hoping to finally meet you." Gabriel laughed. "I guess I ruined that. Well, Miss Brown Eyes, add that charge to my tab." "Will you tell me what happened?" She kept her voice quiet and tried not to let it shake. "Will you tell me why you haven't run away yet?" His blue eyes found hers, and he looked sharply at her. She ducked her head again, hoping the act of submission would cool his sudden flare of anger. Sitting with Gabriel after what happened was a stupid thing to do. He was drunk, and there was no one to rescue her if he decided to get violent. Now was her chance to leave. Inexplicably, however, Gabriel's arm reached out to close the gap between them. He pushed her hair behind her shoulders, his fingers tangling in the waves slowly, very slowly, before he withdrew. The connection of sorts flowed from his fingers and into her hair. Julia absorbed the sensation and hummed again softly, forgetting his question entirely. "You smell like vanilla," he remarked, shifting his body so that he could stare at her properly. "It's my shampoo." He finished his beer and opened another, taking a long pull from the bottle before he turned to her again. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "They love you, you know. You're all they talk about." "The prodigal son, or perhaps a demon. The demon Gabriel." He laughed bitterly and finished his beer in almost one swallow. He opened another. "They were so happy you were coming home. That's why your mother invited me to dinner." "She isn't my mother, and maybe Grace invited you because she knew I needed a brown-eyed angel to watch over me." Gabriel leaned closer so that he could cup her cheek. Julia inhaled sharply as his touch surprised her, his large blue eyes gazing at her in intoxicated surprise. He moved the pad of his thumb across her blush and hesitated, almost as if he was absorbing the heat from her skin. When he withdrew his hand, Julia almost cried out at the loss. He placed his bottle down on the porch and stood up quickly. "The sun is setting. Would you like to go for a walk?" She bit her lip. She knew she shouldn't. This was Gabriel from the photograph, and possibly her one and only chance to see him and to spend time in his presence. After what had happened earlier, she doubted he'd be coming home again. At least, not for a long, long time. She placed the blanket to one side and stood up. "Bring the blanket," he said, and when she scooped it up under her arm, he took her smaller hand in his. She gasped. A tingling sensation began at the tips of her fingers and traveled slowly through her arm until it reached her shoulder and skated to her heart, causing it to beat much faster. He brought his head closer to hers. Have you ever held a boy's hand before? She shook her head, and he laughed softly. Then I'm glad I'm your first. They walked slowly into the woods, quickly disappearing from the view of the Clark's house. Julia liked the way her hand fit in his, and the way his long fingers curved across the back of hers. He held her gently but securely, squeezing her from time to time, perhaps to reassure her of his presence. Julia began to think that this was the way holding hands with someone was supposed to feel, not that she had any experience. She'd only ventured into the woods a time or two before, and always with Rachel. She knew that if something went wrong, she'd most likely get lost trying to find her way home. She pushed such thoughts to the back of her mind and focused her attention entirely on what it felt like to hold the enigmatic Gabriel's warm, strong hand. I used to spend a lot of time here. It's very peaceful. Up ahead, there's an old apple orchard. Has Rachel shown it to you? Julia shook her head. Gabriel gazed down at her in what looked like a serious expression. You're awfully quiet. You can talk to me. I promise I won't bite. He flashed her one of his winning smiles, one Julia recognized from Rachel's photographs. Why did you come home? He ignored Julia's question and kept walking, but she noticed that he began to grip her hand more tightly. She tightened her grip on his as well to signal to him that she was not afraid, even though she was. I didn't want to come home, not like this. I lost something, and I've been drunk for weeks. Gabriel's honesty surprised her. But if you lost something, maybe you could try to find it. He narrowed his eyes. What I lost is lost forever. He began walking more quickly, and Julia had to hasten her strides just to keep up with him. I came home for money. That's how desperate and absolutely fucked I am. Gabriel's voice softened and Julia felt him shudder. I was fucked up even before I destroyed everything and everyone, before you ever arrived. I'm so sorry. He shrugged and began to drag her to the left. We're almost there. Through an opening in the trees, they entered a small clearing that was carpeted in thick grass. Wildflowers and weeds and old rotting stumps littered the expanse of green. The air was quiet and vibrated with peace, and at the edge of the open area stood several aged apple trees, weary-looking and worn. This is it, he gestured widely. This is paradise. He pulled Julia to a large rock that stood inexplicably at the edge of the clearing, and lifted her by her waist so that she was perched on top of it. Then he climbed to her side. Julia shivered. The rock was cold in the shade of the setting sun, and was already sending chills through her thin jeans. Gabriel shrugged out of his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. You'll catch pneumonia and die, he said absently, placing an arm around her and drawing her close to his side. His body heat radiated from his bare arms and his t-shirt, warming her immediately. She inhaled deeply and sighed with contentment, marveling at how well she fit under the crook of his arm, as if she'd been made for him. You're Beatrice. Beatrice? Dante's Beatrice. Julia flushed. I don't know who that is. Gabriel chuckled to himself, his breath warm against her face as he nuzzled her ear with his nose. Didn't they tell you the prodigal son is writing his book on Dante and Beatrice? When Julia didn't answer, he brought his lips to the top of her head and brushed a gentle kiss across her hair. Dante was a poet. Beatrice was his muse. He met her when she was very young, and he loved her from afar his whole life. Beatrice was his guide through paradise. Julia's eyes were closed as she listened to his voice, inhaling the scent that clung to his skin. He smelled of musk and sweat and beer, but Julia ignored those distractions and focused on the scent that was Gabriel, something very masculine and potentially dangerous. There's a painting by an artist named Holiday. You look like his Beatrice. Gabriel reached down and brought her pale fingers to his lips, kissing her skin reverently. Your family loves you. You should make up with them. Julia's own words surprised her, but he only pulled her in more closely. They aren't my family. Not really. And it's too late anyway, Beatrice. Julia started at the name and realized that the beer had definitely caught up with him. But she didn't move her head from resting on his shoulder. A short while later, he was rubbing his hand up and down her arm, trying to attract her attention. You haven't had your dinner? She shook her head. No, I haven't. Shall I feed you? Though it made her sad to do so, she lifted her head from his shoulder. He smiled at her and walked over to one of the remaining apple trees. He studied the boughs of hanging fruit and chose the largest, ripest red apple before picking a smaller one. He put the smaller one in his pocket as he walked back to her. Beatrice. He smiled and handed her the apple. Julia stared at it entranced, as if it were a treasure. Gabriel laughed and moved his hands, extending the fruit in his right palm, the way a child would hold a sugar cube to a pony. Julia took the apple and brought it immediately to her lips, taking a firm bite. He watched her chew. He watched her swallow. Then, in silent satisfaction, he resumed his former position, his arm tight around her waist. He pressed her head gently to his shoulder and began eating the smaller apple that he had hidden in his pocket. They sat very still at the sunset, and just before the orchard was covered in darkness, Gabriel took the blanket from under Julia's arm and spread it like a bed on the grass. Come, Beatrice. He held his hand out to her. Julia knew it would be a very foolish thing to take his hand and to sit with him on the blanket, but she didn't care. She'd developed a crush on him the first time Rachel had shown his photograph to her, and Julia had stolen it. Now that he was here, real, breathing alive, in flesh, all she could do was take his hand. Have you ever lain next to a boy and looked up at the stars? He pulled her down to the blanket and watched her as they lay there on their backs. No. Gabriel threaded his fingers through hers and placed the connection that was theirs on top of his heart. She could feel it beating slowly beneath her touch as she took comfort in his steady rhythm. You're beautiful, Beatrice, like a brown-eyed angel. Julia turned her head so she could look at him and smile. I think you're beautiful. She shyly began to run her fingers along his jaw, marveling at the way the stubble felt under her hand. He smiled at her touch and closed his eyes. She traced his features gently for a long time until her arm began to grow tired. He opened his eyes. Thank you. Julia smiled and squeezed his hand, feeling his heart leap at her movement. Have you ever been kissed by a boy? She blushed deeply and shook her head. Then I'm glad I'm your first. Gabriel propped himself up on his side and leaned over. His eyes shone gently, and he smiled down at her. Julia managed to close her eyes before his perfect mouth found hers. She floated. Gabriel's lips were warm and inviting, and he spread them over her mouth carefully, as if he were worried he might bruise her. Not knowing how to kiss and still slightly wary, Julia kept her mouth closed. Gabriel brought his hand up to cup the curve of her cheek, caressing the skin with his thumb as his lips moved softly over hers. This kiss was not what she expected. She had expected him to be careless or slightly rough. She had expected his kiss to be desperate and urgent, and perhaps for his fingertips to trail along her skin and down her body to places she wasn't ready to let him touch. But he kept his hands where they were, one caressing the small of her back and the other at her cheek. His kiss was tender and sweet, the kind of kiss she imagined a lover giving his beloved after a long absence. Gabriel kissed Julia as if he knew her, as if she belonged to him. His kiss was passionate and full of emotion. as if every fiber of his being had melted and spread itself on his lips only to be given to her. Her heart skidded in her chest at the thought. She had never dared to hope for such a first kiss. Somehow, as the pressure of his lips lessened, she felt like bursting into tears, knowing that she'd never be kissed like that again. He had ruined her for anyone else forever. Gabriel sighed deeply as he released her and pressed his lips gently to her forehead. "Open your eyes." Julia looked up into a pair of blue orbs that were startlingly clear and very emotional. But she could not decipher the emotions. He smiled and pressed his lips to her forehead again before rolling onto his back and gazing up at the stars. "What are you thinking?" She shifted herself so that she was curled up at his side, close but not touching him with her body. "I was thinking how I waited for you. I waited, and you never came." He smiled at her sadly. "I'm sorry, Gabriel." "You're here now. Apparuit iam beatitudo vestra." Beatitudo. Apparuit iam beat something in Latin. "I don't know what that means." She sounded shy. "It means now your blessedness appears. But really, it should be now my blessedness appears, now that you're here." He pulled her closer, snaking his arms beneath her neck and down to her waist, where he splayed his hand, fingers wide, at the small of her back. "For the rest of my life, I'll dream of hearing your voice breathe my name." Julia smiled at herself in the darkness. "Have you ever fallen asleep in the arms of a boy before, Beatrice?" She shook her head. "Then I'm glad I'm your first." He pulled her so that her head rested on his chest near his heart, and her delicate body molded perfectly to his side. Like Adam's rib, he whispered into her hair. "Do you have to leave?" She whispered back, running her hands hesitantly over his chest, up and down and back and forth. "Yes, not tonight." "Will you come back?" Her voice was almost a whimper. Gabriel sighed deeply. "I'm going to be thrown out of paradise tomorrow, Beatrice. Our only hope is that you find me afterward. Look for me in hell." He gently rolled her onto her back and placed his hand on either side of her hips, hovering over her, eyes wide, staring longingly and intensely down into her very soul. And then he brought his lips to hers. What can you say about that chapter? It explains a few things, like they've met. But he doesn't seem to remember that. My guess would be he was very, very drunk. And he's talked about, not good at resisting temptation. My guess would be it wasn't just alcohol that got him in that huge fight. It was he'd probably had a few pre-party toots of something. So, whatever. We'll find out later on, I guess, because it looks like the next chapter is going to jump right back into the present. And guys, I wish I had time for that right now, but I have to run. So until next time, this is Couch Potato Mike reminding you that in the end we're all stories. So let's make them good ones. See you next time.